For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sophia McLennan. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies. I'm a faculty member in the School of International Affairs. And I'm here to introduce to you our speaker for today, Norm Solomon. His talk is called U.S. Media Coverage of Global Conflict, How Our Windows on the World Get Tinted Red, White, and Blue. Norman's an American journalist, media critic, author, and activist. I think he'd probably tell you that those things all go together and are not easy to separate. He's a longtime associate of fairness and accuracy in reporting, otherwise known as FAIR. It's a media watch group. He co-founded rootsaction.org, which galvanizes people who are committed to political and social issues, and has an online activist group with over 1.5 million active supporters. He's the founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, which aims to provide journalists with alternative and accurate sources. Norman has also authored a dozen books, including Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, and Wizards of Media Oz, Behind the Curtain of Mainstream News. A collection of his columns won the George Orwell Award for distinguished contribution to honesty and clarity in public language. I want to also remind you that after the lecture, there'll be time for Q&A. We'll ask people to come up and stand behind the mic, or I see one mic, so maybe it'll only be one side. We'll hopefully get in a good bit of time for questions. And then also, after the talk, we will have a book signing of the book he's speaking off of, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. It'll be available for purchase, and you can buy a copy and get it signed. So with that, please offer a warm welcome to our speaker, Norm Solomon.
Thanks a lot, Sophia, and I really want to thank the Center for Global Studies for bringing me here to Penn State, and also to thank you for being here this afternoon. And I want to welcome everybody already seated and everybody just arriving. Well, Mark Twain had a very dear friend he worked with for about 40 years. Named William Dean Howells. He was an editor at the Atlantic Monthly, an excellent writer in his own right. And I want to share with you something that Howells wrote in a short story in 1905. And keep in mind, this was in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. It's a short story called Editha. And in there at one point, character in the story exclaims, "What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway." So here we are more than a full century later, and that comment still applies. What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway. A long time ago, Napoleon said it's not necessary to censor the news, it's sufficient to delay it until it no longer matters. We've, in our own lifetimes, experienced the media spin telling us about this war effort or that military strike by the US, and then months or years later we find out not only that it wasn't necessarily so, but it wasn't so. But after so much time has passed, it's just too late. Now, what I'm going to talk about and share with you today is not exactly a new phenomenon. There's a great book some of you may have read called The First Casualty by Philip Knightley, and it was published several decades ago. And he talks about going back centuries where people were sent off to war on the basis of flat-out lies and fabrications and all sorts of nonsense that was peddled as absolute truth. And, when I go to campuses and I talk with people, I'm often reminded one way or another that no pun intended, this is not just an academic topic. When I speak to an audience, speaking to people whose mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters have gone off to war. Sometimes they haven't come back. Sometimes their bodies have been shattered. Sometimes their spirits shattered as well. So I'm here not only to give you a historical analysis or a take on how media is spun, but also to talk to you about what has affected people you know, as well as people you don't. What has affected Americans, but also those who live in countries that we've never visited. As I mentioned, these are not new phenomena, but there are some extraordinary aspects to what we in the United States are subjected to, what that window on the world that's tinted red, white, and blue that we're encouraged to see the world through, what it is all about, how it is fabricated and put together, and why it is so powerful in distorting and blocking our vision. United States, the most powerful military on the planet and in history, an unparalleled technological dominance, a massive communications apparatus worldwide, which includes inside the United States a capacity for the US government and massive military contractors to communicate all sorts of messages directly and indirectly, news media through mass entertainment, television, all the rest of it, popularized films, mass-marketed entertainment, to convey to us what encourages us to be passive and acceptant and to see the world through that tinted window. Variously ascribed to Mark Twain or Will Rogers is the comment that it's not what people don't know that bothers me, it's what they know that just ain't so. And a lot of what we know about the world that perhaps just ain't so is naturally communicated through media, through politician speak, perhaps through our textbooks, because we haven't gone to those countries that are being discussed. We have not been in those political and geopolitical conflict zones. We haven't been in those war zones. And so we get the information second, third, fifth, 10th hand. And the entertainment industry, which I'm going to refer to a little bit later in more detail, also shapes how we look at the world. We assume what has happened 50, 20, 10 years ago or yesterday, what some of the configurations are in terms of the basic elements involved and what we've got to do with it. And there is also the overarching reality that now we're encouraged to celebrate that the United States, unlike 20, 30, 40 years ago, can wear the mantle of the world's only superpower. I want to sort of do the quick, we don't have a lot of time here, so I'm just going to go through 5 or 6 decades. You know, it's like I think the old Woody Allen story about somebody who took a speed reading course and then gave a book report on War and Peace. And the book report was, it's about Russia. And that was the end of the book report. So I am going to acknowledge that I'm going to leave a lot out here given the need for brevity. But let's jump in at the time of the escalation of the Vietnam War in August of 1964. If you go back in the microfilm, you'll see the big headlines as I saw the New York Times and Washington Post. The US ships, 2 of them attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam by the North Vietnamese, and then within 3 days of the second supposed attack, Congress, with barely a dissent, 2 in the Senate, voting the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War, If you've gone to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, those 55,000 names there are on that wall because of what occurred in the media coverage at that time and subsequently that gave rise to and then followed up on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and then 2 to 3 million Vietnamese deaths as well, a consequence of media coverage. And it turned out that the media coverage of what occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin was absolutely unequivocal at the time and absolutely false. As Lyndon Johnson, we later found out, said in the White House about a year later, for all we know, our boys were shooting at whales out there. It turned out that the second attack was complete fabrication. The first one may well have not taken place, and more to the point, perhaps, the United States had been shelling the North Vietnamese coast before these reported incidents. So this is a paradigm of the U.S. as victim, and then we find out much later on the United States was actually launching an attack prior to what was reported. In the book, War Made Easy, I write about how about a third of a century later, I went back to the original reporting, and on the front page of the Washington Post was the lead story about the Gulf of Tonkin events by a reporter named Murray Marder. And so I reached him by telephone. At that point, he had been retired. And I said, well, of course, Mr. Marder, we now know that these were complete fabrications that the Post reported at the time about what happened in the Tonkin Gulf. Do you know if the Washington Post has ever published a retraction? And he said, why no? We never published a retraction of those stories. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, if we were going to retract that story, then the U.S. mass media would have to retract almost an entire coverage of the whole Vietnam War. So I was just on the phone hearing that and thinking, well, this is a paradigm that tells us a lot about how, as Napoleon mentioned, after the fact, any effort to correct the record is, to put it mildly, too little and too late. And even then, the most powerful media in our own country are reticent to acknowledge the falsehoods that they promoted by relying on official government sources in the first place. They're one of these great myths, and it has to do with wars that the U.S. is directly involved in or indirectly involved in or not involved in at all, but there's some reporting on. You may have heard this, that television brings wars into our living room. Ever heard that? And TV news, it's so vivid, and this supposedly began with the Vietnam War, and it turned the tide because people could see what wars were about. And it's amazing to me how, through repetition in the mass media, all the smart guys and occasional women who are allowed on TV to talk about these issues, how contentions that, when you step back, are well-nigh preposterous, become accepted as conventional wisdom. Yes, television, news coverage on TV brings war into our living room. There's a book that was published in the late 1980s by Mark Crispin Miller called Boxed In, The Culture of TV. And he makes the hidden in plain sight simple point that, can you imagine anything less like being in a war zone than watching a report about a war zone on television? Get up, you get a snack from the refrigerator, maybe go to the bathroom during the commercial, you watch more of the coverage of the war, and yet we're encouraged to believe that somehow that has brought the war home to us in some way, when, as anybody who's in the middle of a war can tell you, a war is a 180 from that. It's complete chaos, it's terror that goes on, that's experienced by the people who are involved. There's another myth which has really carried forward, and that is the idea that somehow in the United States during the Vietnam War, and supposedly this has had an effect to the present day, that the realities of the war were at least broadcast, put on TV, so that we would learn about them, we would see them, and that's why people turned against the war. It's a very interesting idea if true, but it's not true. Daniel Hallen, professor, did a very detailed study going back through the old footage on, at that time it was 3 networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, the nightly news, Walter Cronkite and all those icons, and he found that it was very, very rare for network TV to show any appreciable amount of footage of violence, of suffering, of war, of bloodshed from the Vietnam War. I'm not just talking 1964 and 65, I'm talking 1968, 70, 72, and what we remember, like Morley Safer reporting for CBS of the Zippo lighters of the Marines lighting the Vietnamese huts to burn down the village, we remember them because they were so rare. They were so rarely conveyed to us. But what is conveyed to us so routinely, TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, online these days, and certainly in Hollywood-type films, that our country is a liberating force. Often the victim that becomes a liberating force. And that kind of message is, of course, very powerful. It gives us our sense of identity. If you want to use the metaphor of a window, it's sort of a type of a tint that tells us, we're the heroes. We're always the heroes. We're sometimes slow to anger. We are the source of virtue. We are up against the wicked of the world. And we're often told that our patience sometimes wears thin and that we must be willing to take that step, as reluctant as we are to go out and slaughter people. The first President Bush, after the Gulf War in 1991, said triumphantly, "We've kicked the Vietnam Syndrome for good," and the Vietnam Syndrome being a sort of a shorthand for, people in America got fed up with the war and forced the war to end, so therefore that syndrome is one that got in the way of our proper interventions. And that celebration in the 1990s, in some sense, has carried through to the present moment. There are disconnects that I want to focus on in particular. One of them is what I refer to as the technological prowess of the United States. If you go to Luxembourg or some other very small country, it's a very different perspective. It's not that we are the gift to the world, we should help run the world. It is, we're one of many, many countries, we're small, and we have to figure out how to make this world work together without our country trying to dominate. And the same goes in terms of technology, because countries that don't have this enormous technological capacity, you're not going to find the kind of attitude that is really inbred in us at this point through the mass media. And that is that, subtly or not, we're encouraged to believe that because the US military has such incredible technological capacity, that somehow that reinforces, or in some sense even proves, that we are on the side of righteousness, that we kill reluctantly in a clean way. We do it technologically, and we do it in a, if you will, a civilized manner as much as can be done. What a contrast with the suicide bomber when he or she straps explosives to the belt or packs an automobile or a truck with explosives and drives it through barricades and kills a bunch of people. We, by mass media and by politicians in this country, are assumed or encouraged to assume that that is the height of barbarism, in contrast to the way we do it. We send in the cruise missiles. We send in the drones. We have people in Nevada who are in front of a computer console who press the button. We have the bombers from high in the air, and we do it in a civilized manner. But I wanted you to ask yourself, if you're at the other end of those missiles, the cruise missiles, the drones, what kind of difference that would make to you? The glorified war that was hailed as the perfect war in our lifetimes was the bombing of Yugoslavia, when for 78 straight days, US-led NATO forces bombed Belgrade, bombed other cities in Serbia, bombed Kosovo, and this was, we were told again and again, a really picture-perfect execution of military operations. Not a single American died in those 78 days. And that was assumed to be great. Of course, roads and bridges and hospitals were demolished in Belgrade, major city, much bigger than, say, Pittsburgh. But that was okay because Thomas Friedman in the New York Times told us that it was necessary, and we all know Thomas Friedman is a good liberal. These were a lot of the assumptions made at the time. And so in a marketplace, as occurred one Friday, a woman carrying a bag of carrots that she had just purchased has her body shredded by cluster bombs from the United States. That was just the way it goes. That also is the way that the window on the world, tinted red, white, and blue, blocks us from, in a sense, a basic sense of humanity. News media narrowing the range of political discourse, politicians who have this synergistic relationship with corporate and government-fed news media, continuing to keep the discourse narrow so that people saying things like what I'm saying to you very rarely are going to get on TV, very rarely get into the mass media in general. In his introduction to Brave New World, the new introduction he wrote after World War II, Aldous Huxley made a point. He said, lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. So it's not only what we're told in our mass media, in our entertainment that we get every day. It's what we don't get told. What we didn't get told, for instance, when the US invaded that dangerous, huge power called Grenada in the Caribbean in 1983, invaded Panama in 1989, launched the Gulf War in 1991, bombed Serbia and Kosovo in 1999, invaded Afghanistan in 2001, invaded Iraq in 2003, helped with the overthrow of a government to create chaos in Libya later on, and I'm leaving out so many military exercises and countries that I could mention. These are the kind of silences that tell us sort of fairy tales. You and I are being told fairy tales about what our government is doing in our names with our tax dollars. We're like lost in the funhouse, the place we go to ride the roller coasters, and you go in with the distorting mirrors. We're put right in front of those mirrors and say, this is you. This is Uncle Sam. This is what you, with your passivity and silence, accept because you're encouraged to do so by the mass media, by those who run the government. A real breakthrough came for this propaganda model in 1991 with the Gulf War. Cable television had come into its own. The capacity for the Pentagon to show fairly dramatic, if grainy, footage of missiles flying in to hit a building in Baghdad. This was very thrilling to the mass media, this country, the anchors, they were in overdrive. They were over the moon. And the War Made Easy book has many examples and quotations. These are these esteemed journalists. These are supposed to be our great journalists. They're showing this footage of missiles flying into, oh yeah, they hit a hospital once in a while, they hit apartment buildings, they hit some military targets, they hit bridges and other facilities in urban areas, which the Pentagon says is dual use, so it's okay. And there are quotes like wonderful, beautiful, fantastic, thrilling. These are our journalists describing these attacks that are taking the lives of, yes, men, women, and children on a systematic basis. 6 weeks after the end of that Gulf War in 1991, Colin Powell, who was then the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was interviewed. This was March 22nd, 1991, and he was asked, well, General, in the last 6 weeks, in the 6 weeks of this Gulf War, from the U.S. bombardment, tell us how many Iraqi people were killed. And I want to quote to you what General Powell said. It's really not a number I'm terribly interested in. As it happened the same day, the Associated Press reported that U.S. military sources said 100,000 Iraqi people had died during that 6 weeks. Now, for one thing, of course, people are not statistics. I certainly think a loved one of yours would not be a statistic only. For another, that's a lot of people. I mentioned Thomas Friedman a bit earlier. I'm not picking on him for any particular reason. He's eminent. He's a columnist for the New York Times. I'm not going after Fox News here. There's plenty to denounce in the right-wing media as well. I'm talking about the eminent Times columnist. At about the time that the roads and bridges and hospitals were being bombed in Serbia and Kosovo, Friedman's classic book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, came out. And this is what he said in it, quote, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the U.S. Air Force F-15. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps," unquote. Well, it was a few years later, I made some trips to Baghdad before the invasion of Iraq. And my third trip was in late January of 2003. So as it turned out, that was a little under 2 months before the invasion began. And I went on that trip with a former fairly high official who ran the Oil for Food program for the United Nations, Dennis Halliday. And we, as in the previous trips I'd gone on, we actually met with the number 2 person in the Iraqi government, Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister. And Dennis Halliday brought with him from New York a copy of the latest Time magazine. You can imagine wasn't exactly on the magazine racks for sale in Baghdad at the time. And Tariq Aziz glanced at the cover, which had a picture of Donald Rumsfeld on it. You may remember Donald Rumsfeld was the defense secretary at the time. And this is what he said. I wrote it down. Aziz said, "Rumsfeld has become quite a warmonger. He did not seem so when he came and visited us in the 1980s, unquote. Well, what Aziz was referring to was what has happened so often. I mentioned the invasion of Panama. Well, you had Manuel Noriega was a CIA asset, but then later on he crossed the United States, so then he's a bad guy, and so the invasion takes place in '89. Well, same thing. Rumsfeld, as an emissary for the Reagan administration, went in. There's footage of him shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and he actually was helping Iraq at the time slaughter people in Iran. Iraq was in the midst of what became an 8-year so-called War of the Cities between the two countries. They were buddy-buddy, the U.S. and Iraqi Saddamite officials at that point. But there was a falling out, and there are falling outs that happen, and in this case, of course, the United States invaded as a consequence. I've been referring to U.S. military actions, but I also want to say a bit about other kinds of conflicts that take many lives around the world, and the United States isn't directly involved. U.S. media don't give a narration of direct U.S. military involvement, but the U.S. is a hand behind the lethal throne in helping and sustaining the slaughter. So we just click through a few decades. 1965, Indonesia. There was a bloodbath. About 500,000 people were killed. And if you go back through the archives, you'll see the New York Times was praising this as a wonderful cleansing of the commies. It turned out that we found out much later, the U.S. Embassy was supplying the names of people for the Indonesian dictatorship to kill at the time. And then you go another 10 years or so to the mid-1970s, when the U.S. government gave a lot of armaments and a green light to the Indonesian government to begin to slaughter people in East Timor, which had a population of about 700,000, and about a third of them were killed in a matter of a few years. And then Jimmy Carter, the humanitarian president, came in the beginning of 1997 as president, and the Indonesians were running low on armaments to kill people in East Timor, and so Carter green-lighted sending more armaments to the Indonesian government. This is, again, as Huxley talked about, the silence that is a form of messaging, that is a form of a propaganda system, or if you will, in terms of a window on the world that shatters any kind of window that can give us a clear view of what is being done on an ongoing basis in our names with our tax dollars by what we're told is our government. So fast forward to the mid-1980s. In Nicaragua, I knew a young guy when I was living in Oregon at the time in the 1980s, and he, years later, went off to Nicaragua to help people there build little water system plants in the countryside. And his name was Ben Linder. And one day, some Contras came up and executed him with a bullet through the head. That bullet was paid for by the U.S. government. And the killing of Ben Linder got some coverage here because he was an American. But there were thousands and thousands of Nicaraguan people who died because of the U.S. Contra War, the Contra Army that was essentially creation of the CIA, funded through the U.S. Our fingerprints weren't directly on it. It wasn't a U.S. war, and yet the consequences were deadly for many people. Let me go up to the present now. You've seen stories the last few days in the news media about the apparent murder of the journalist Khashoggi inside the consulate, the Saudi consulate. Well, the U.S. government has been like this with the Saudis for many, many decades. And the fact is that for several years now, the Saudi government has been leading a bombing effort that is causing massive deaths and injuries, a cholera epidemic. Many children are dying in Yemen. And it was green-lighted by President Obama. It continues to be green-lighted and supported by President Trump. And yet, the suffering in Yemen, according to our news media, rarely reported in this country by the mass media, has almost no fingerprints coming from Washington. So indirectly, this is not a U.S. war, and yet this ongoing catastrophe in Yemen is possible only because of support from Washington. Looking forward to your questions. I think I would be remiss, though, if I didn't first say a little bit about the enemy du jour, or I guess my French is not that good. I just say decade in French, the enemy of the decade now, almost, and that is Russia. We've been constantly told by our mass media that now Russia is our enemy. You may remember, and this is sort of reminiscent of just back in when we were reading 1984. Remember? We all read 1984. You wake up and you find out who the new enemy is. And maybe there's been a switch overnight. How did you find out? Because you've been told, and then you're supposed to believe that. Remember in one of the debates between Romney and Obama in 2012, it would have been, right? And Romney said something about, Russia's dangerous, and Obama said something like, oh, that's so 20th century. You're so behind the times, But now we've been told in the last several years anyway, if not the full decade, that it is Russia. And part of the way that the U.S. media and political system convey to us that we should only look through, don't look at the man or woman behind the curtain, just look through this window that we've helpfully provided to you that's red, white, and blue. One of the ways that that window is continually reinforced and put in front of us is to simply say history doesn't matter. We're not going to talk about history. We don't care if you know about history. We're certainly not going to remind you of history. And it even seeps down into the vernacular. What does it mean if I say to you, oh, that's history? It's often a connotation of that's dismissive. It doesn't matter. That was then, this is now, but now it's connected to then. Otherwise, we wouldn't study history to begin with. So what is it about Russia? Well, when the Berlin Wall fell, we know, this is clearly documented, this was under the administration of the first President Bush. There was a clear pledge made that if Germany would reunite, and then, as it turned out, on its last legs, the Soviet Union would agree to allow Germany to be reunited, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And yet, in the last 19 years, NATO has moved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles in many directions up to the Russian border. And I want to ask you, remember back the Warsaw Pact, and when Russia was part of a military alliance? What do you think the reaction would have been in the U.S. media or in Washington if the Warsaw Pact got Canada to join up or Mexico to join up? People would have gone nuts. They would have freaked out. They would have said it was equivalent to declaring war on the United States. And yet, this is, with rare mention in the U.S. media, this is what has occurred, a broken promise, moving U.S. military forces and a military alliance up to the Russian border. We'll say, well, we might say, well, they're Russians, they're bad people. That you can say that. There is a thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which the U.S. has attempted to enforce. But we're told, well, the Russians, that's a sphere of influence. Only we get to have a sphere of influence. They don't get to at all. You can say, yeah, but they're real militaristic, they're aggressive. Well, there are some interesting facts, inconvenient facts, in that regard. At last count, and I recommend a book called Base Nation that was published a couple of years ago about the U.S. Military bases overseas by David Vine, a professor at American University. At the last count, the United States has about 800 military bases overseas. 800. Russia has 9. 9 military bases outside of Russia. You have to ask yourself why, or you have an opportunity to ask yourself, why is that so rarely mentioned in our US news media? How many politicians in Washington and Congress have you ever heard stand up and say that? Anything about that? Draw attention to that, draw any inference, even mention the fact, even in passing. Then there are some other inconvenient facts. For instance, when the Soviet Union fell and the Russian government per se began, the Russian economy was ravaged by shock therapy, what's known as shock therapy, a sudden jolt into the capitalist world stoked by US profiteering in combination and alliance with Russian oligarchs. And although you wouldn't know it from US media, we have our oligarchs in this country too. What a surprise. And making worldwide history, life expectancy plummeted in Russia in peacetime. Peacetime, just year after year dropping off the life expectancy for Russian people because the ravaging, the plundering that the US helped to engineer for the new Russian society was so severe, was so stark, was so vicious and predatory. And then in 1996, Time magazine had a cover story, and I wonder if you can guess what this cover story was. I'll give you a hint. It has to do, well, I think meddling would be mild a term. It had a big drawing on the cover of Boris Yeltsin, who had just been reelected as president of Russia. And the big headline, an exulting headline, said, "Yanks to the rescue." And the story explained how Americans had gotten Boris Yeltsin reelected as president of Russia. He was going down the toilet, frankly, in terms of his electoral capacity until the Americans came in and this was celebrated. So, as is often the case, superpowers try to meddle with each other, but you wouldn't know that from US mass media because we're supposed to be the other side is supposed to be the sinners. One other point. Early in the second Bush administration, this very important treaty, the ABM treaty, was abrogated unilaterally by the US. And since that time, the US has been putting all sorts of ABM missile systems up along the border, pretty near Russia. It's very dangerous from their standpoint. You talk about windows on the world. Look at the world out the Kremlin window. And you see how the narrative that we're getting from the mass media is part of the truth, but a lot of other people have a lot of other truths around the world. I want to say a little bit about entertainment. Sometimes people treat news media as entertainment, but there is avowed entertainment, what we see at the multiplex, right? And I want to say something about American Sniper, which the last time I checked set box office records. Remember the Clint Eastwood directed American Sniper? And you may remember that in there, the hero counters a critique from his wife. His wife is sort of the naysayer. He's gung-ho, he's been in Iraq, he's very happy about what he's done as an American sniper, and she's saying, I don't know if this was so good after all. I don't know if this war was so good. I don't know if going in to Iraq and staying there is such a smart idea. And at the end of the film, she's totally won over. She totally believes in the war effort. This is a sort of a different way to send a message to the millions of people who watch the film. And it reminded me of something that I saw 45, 50 years earlier as a kid. And that was a movie called The Green Beret. Anybody here seen The Green Berets? Starring John Wayne. And in that film, it wasn't the wife who was the naysayer, it was the newspaper reporter. And in that story, he comes in, his hair is sort of shaggy, so you knew 1960s Argot that meant visually you maybe didn't want to trust him. But John Wayne sort of tolerates him for a while until this newspaper reporter sees the light, that the war is good, it's necessary, some people suffer, but America has a role to play in the world. And I think, and I'll close on this note and then look forward to your questions, yes, America has a role to play in the world. It's not a choice, as news media would tell us so often, between being isolationist or engaged in the world. The question is, what kind of engagement will we have with the world? I think that it's always helpful to go back and read some of the most important speeches from Martin Luther King Jr. We all know I Have a Dream, right? At the March on Washington. But even though we almost never hear or see mention of it in the US news media, he gave speeches after that. He didn't just go into semi-retirement waiting to be assassinated. And he joined all the way the anti-war movement in 1967. And the effort to reduce Martin Luther King to a hero on a postage stamp as a holiday is part of trying to rewrite and block out and silence history that, to the war machinery, is, put it mildly, inconvenient. 1967, Dr. King said that the United States government, and I'm quoting here, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And he also said, I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism. In this time, in this place, in our lives, there's a strong case to be made that the United States government is still the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that raises a question to each and every one of us. Do we intend to adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism? So we have a microphone set up here, and your questions are very welcome.
Hi, so first I'd like to thank you for coming. It was a great presentation. You primarily talked about the problems with the fake news and the media, but do you have any real solutions on how to fix it? I feel like it's been going on for a long time and there's no real solution to fix the problem.
Well, I mean, arguably, the news that I mentioned about the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 was fake news, or whatever you want to call it, fabrication, government propaganda, whatever, with, to put it mildly, untoward results. And it's necessary to solve a problem to first diagnose it correctly, like an illness, if you will. So analyzing it, I think, is necessary but insufficient. It's like plowing the ground. It doesn't mean you're going to get the crops, but first you've got to plow the ground. So I think this sort of discussion of what are the real elements of a propaganda system is very important. How do we solve it? Well, one aspect of how to solve it is to be media literate, to encourage ourselves and each other to be not cynical but skeptical about the news, to discern propaganda, to ask ourselves when we see a TV news report, when we read an article, when we are listening to a radio broadcast, who are the sources? How wide or narrow is the sourcing? Are we hearing only from government officials and corporate, military affiliated and aligned think tanks, or are we hearing from a wide range of viewpoints? So analyzing the news media, very important. challenging and critiquing the news media very important. You know, we've been encouraged to believe that if you picket a TV station or a newspaper office, you're somehow, you know, interfering with the First Amendment. No, you're using the First Amendment. They're using the First Amendment. You should as well. And I'd say another key aspect is we need to build our own media outlets. The barriers to entry, as you know, are lower than ever. You can set up your own website. You can adopt standards of independent reporting and commentary. And I encourage people to do that because that's an essential part of the solution.
If I could just build off that really quickly. Sure. I think it's like the average American, it's really hard for them to be educated about all this. Should there be any punishments put in place for media that abuses their reach for the people, or that be too much impeding on freedom of the press?
Well, the First Amendment, I think, has to be protected, but at the same time, I think we need to recognize that hypothetically, I don't anticipate this will happen, but if I were thrown in prison and put in solitary confinement, technically I would have free speech rights. I could say anything I wanted, just nobody would hear it, right? And so we need to find ways to build media institutions that can be heard, can be seen. And this is a challenge because the big money is on the other side. It's parallel and intersects with the struggle over who's going to be elected to Congress, to the legislature, to governor, to president, and so forth. Big money is able to dominate, but that doesn't mean that we can't defeat big money. And that's true in the media arena as well, at least to widen the range of voices, because I don't want my voice to be the only voice by any means. I don't want people to agree with me. I just want, it's like a healthy forest. A healthy ecology in a forest has a lot of different elements, and that should be true of mass media.
Great answer, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I've long been a fan of your work.
Thank you.
You came to UDC, Union for Democratic Communication, back in 2006 to speak about the military-industrial complex. And so I have a media question. I'm a faculty in media studies, and I wonder what media do you think is doing it right? I mean, I have some favorite go-to media like Democracy Now! I think they do a pretty good job of kind of filling in the holes left by the propaganda model that, you know, Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman talk about, that I know that your work is, you know, kind of animates, like you kind of show we don't have direct censorship in this country, but we have this de facto censorship, and in a sense, dealing with propaganda. So, like, what media do you think is doing it right? Hopefully it's not just Democracy Now! I'd like to learn some new sources and recommend some new sources to my students. And then if you have any additional ideas about how our students can go about building, you know, a better model, what they can do.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of wonderful independent media outlets that are doing great work. They are almost always, I would say, underfunded. And you have these enormous media outlets who, you know, probably a lot of the best media outlets that are doing good independent reporting based in the United States have budgets, you know, not much larger than the alcohol budget of the New York Times. You know, seriously. There's so much being done on shoestrings, and I have my particular favorites, not that any of them are the gospel. I would never put forward any media outlets like that. You mentioned Democracy Now!, which is on radio, TV, and also, of course, online, and virtually all these outlets have online components. But, you know, I'm very supportive and enthusiastic about Common Dreams, for instance, Truth Out, Truth Dig, antiwar.com. And those are just a few. And I think people ought to be willing to explore, but also have what I think was Ernest Hemingway called the BS detector out, because there's a lot of garbage out there. And there's a lot that doesn't really pass the sniff test. I think building independent media outlets takes time. As I referred to it, it does take money. And if you're providing a service to people that they appreciate, then it can open the door for them to sustain it financially. And I think it's built over a period of time. I like to say, not really hyperbolically, that not much gets accomplished in a matter of weeks or months. But it really takes years to build the organizations that we need, the media outlets that can sustain over the long haul. I also think that a wide menu, if you will, of media diet is very important. I would go so far as to say that if people, say, read the New York Times or read the Washington Post and watched the PBS NewsHour and watched Democracy Now! And read commondreams.org every day, okay, that'll take you 2 or 3 hours. But you can really compare and contrast. Yes, there's some overlap, but there's some diametrically different ways of seeing the world. And a lot of the problem right now is that people are comparing A to A, or the range of views that we're getting in the mass media are, they run the gamut from A to C. And there's a whole other alphabet of possibilities out there for journalism that is going on, and people are not able to compare and contrast. So, I know a lot of folks who are very discerning and well-informed and well-educated, and they watch the PBS NewsHour 5 days a week, and they feel that they're informed, and they look at the New York Times. They feel that they understand the way the world is really functioning. And frankly, I find that frightening, because for one thing, if you look at it in political terms, the New York Times would be considered a center right-wing newspaper in much of Europe, Western Europe, even now. And yet the spectrum in this country is so narrow that we're encouraged to believe, oh, this is some kind of leftist newspaper. It's not. And if we have a wider range of views and sources of information, then we have more possibilities to inform ourselves and make really well-informed decisions. And the other thing I'd note on that is what I was saying, for instance, about Russia. You can read the New York Times carefully 365 days in the last year, and you learn almost nothing about how Russians see the world. And that's dangerous.
I wanted to ask you something about your remarks about Vietnam. We know, I think, that vast numbers of Americans turned against the war at a certain point. So I'm wondering if the news media were apologists for the war, with few exceptions, as you said. How did that happen?
Because people organized and educated themselves. We had millions of people every week reading what we called underground newspapers. They were not entertainment sheets, as many of them have recently evolved into, but they brought news. The Liberation News Service mailed out articles and graphics and photos that were then reprinted, reaching millions of people literally every month. Ramparts magazine exposed much of what was going on in the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King said that one of the reasons, the catalyst, the straw that broke his resistance to speaking out against the war was photos of the Vietnam War in Ramparts magazine. And it was the combination of independent media and organizing and activism and demonstrations that created that pressure from the bottom up. I lived through it as well as studied it, so I don't hesitate to say this.
Yeah, I would argue for a somewhat more balanced view of the news media's role. I think it's a more complicated story than that. Yes, there was a lot of taking at face value for a long time what the Pentagon was selling to the news media, but I think at a certain point there are a lot of reporters on the ground, including reporters for the big news organizations, who began telling a story that was very much at odds with the Pentagon story. And I think it sounds to me like you're giving a little, maybe too much credit to Ramparts et al., and maybe too little credit to the New York Times and CBS News et al.
Well, in terms of complexity, I certainly agree with you. It's very complex, and I'd refer you to my book, War Made Easy, which has, I don't know, well over 1,000 footnotes, and also to Daniel Hallen's book, I mentioned, The Uncensored War, because he deconstructs this sort of myth that ABC, CBS, and NBC actually promulgated a critical view of the war. In fact, his sort of empirical research is quite to the contrary. Also, there's a very big difference between the news media gradually, as Walter Cronkite did in early 1968, saying that the Vietnam War could not be won. That's what the big change was from Walter Cronkite, which had such a big effect. The Vietnam War could not be won. That was a very different critique than the anti-war movement, which said, whether it can be won or not, it is immoral, it is illegal, it is reprehensible, and it's wrong. The Boston Globe did a survey in February 1968, so we're well into the Vietnam War period. The Boston Globe surveyed a few dozen major daily newspapers, and not a single one had editorialized for U.S. troops to be withdrawn from Vietnam. Now that's pretty stunning. The underground newspapers that I referred to, that I was reading at the time and that have been studied since, you had millions of readers every week reading articles demanding the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. As a matter of fact, I went on 2 marches, the first big one in New York City in April of 1967, where Dr. King spoke, and then the October March on the Pentagon in 1967. We were demanding, as so many people at that point were, U.S. out of Vietnam, and yet here you've got, into 1968, the Globe could not find one daily newspaper editorializing. So it goes to the point that when the people lead, leaders eventually, not necessarily will, but can be made to follow. And the same is true of the corporate media.
I just kind of wanted to bring it a little more into. As the current administration wages war against media, how do you think media outlets will change or alter in the coming years with different administrations, or as well under the current administration?
I think that a single standard of human rights is crucial for journalists and for all of us. And that goes for a single standard on what is good journalism and so forth. It shouldn't depend on whether a Democrat or Republican is in the White House, whether we happen to like that person's policies in general or not, or we voted for them or not. The Media Watch Group FAIR that I've been associated with since its founding in the mid-1980s has always made a point that the news media are too subservient and deferential to the president, whoever it is. And that deference is dangerous. I believe that we have more tough coverage of Donald Trump than any other president, not only in my lifetime, but probably in the history of the United States. And that reason is perhaps obvious if you consider the character, and I use that word advisedly, of the current person in the Oval Office. But in general, I think that we've got to build journalistic institutions that don't bow down literally or figuratively to the president. Don't say, well, he's the president, so we should take his word for it, or just rely on official sources.
I think that essentially the New York Times, the Washington Post, or whoever's still posting these articles nowadays are pushing back against the president in current times. I mean, they're not retracting their statements, so would you consider that essentially a pushback at now?
There's no doubt that the New York Times and the Washington Post are overall very hostile to President Trump. There's very little critique. I mean, for instance, you can read the New York Times and Washington Post, and the $717 billion military budget recently passed by Congress, there's virtually no critique of that. There's virtually no critique from the New York Times and the Washington Post of the military-industrial surveillance complex that we live under, the profiteering from Wall Street, from the war machinery. So we've got these underlying problems that have been there before Trump got to Washington and will be there after he leaves. And I think independent news media can give us a framework that isn't just bouncing around like a billiard ball depending on who happens to be president.
Hello, so I have a bit of a comment and then there'll be a question at the end. But firstly, I just wanted to thank you very much. That was very interesting. I especially appreciated your deconstruction of like the neoconservative narrative surrounding Russia. I was a little bit, I would have to say I disagree with the answer you gave to someone, which is that there's no barriers to entry into the market of journalism. I think actually the opposite is true. When you look at, I'm going to use the example of Alex Jones, who was basically depersoned by every major social and tech platform. But like, I know this pretty well because like I pay a lot of attention to alternative sources of media, alternative sources of opinion, and I know that like the trend is actually that it's becoming increasingly harder to break into this market because the established media has vested interest in keeping out alternative voices. As for what can be done about this, which also someone asked, can take my suggestion, which is to vote for populists who will rhetorically curb stomp these liars on the public space and pull back the curtain to how dishonest the journalist class is. But in line with that, my question is, when we talk about things like a narrative around militarism or around Russia, or say like the Bush administration building up a narrative during the Iraq War to justify like certain things. We're talking about specific instances of like the media not quite fulfilling their role, or like withholding back information from people, or not quite informing people in the ideal way. So we view these as exceptions to the norm. Now, what do you think about the notion that as we can recognize that different classes in society have vested interests because of the class that they are, that the journalist class, because of things like their socioeconomic background, educational background, corporate influence, that these people will always have a vested interest that will cloud their reporting on reality, and therefore it's something that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Quite a few good questions there. Barriers to entry, I'm referring to financial barriers to entry comparative to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Even a couple of decades ago, if you really wanted to potentially reach a mass audience, it took a lot of money to buy a daily newspaper or a TV station or a radio station. The web, which is what I was referring to, has opened up some new possibilities. It doesn't guarantee that you'll reach a lot of people, but the potential is there in a way, I think, that didn't exist a few decades ago. Not sure your context for Alex Jones. I mean, he's somebody who's a spewer of hate and has no interest in facts, and so I think that is a reality, and we need to recognize that sort of hatred and hostility to basic facts is something that should be named as such. You referred to neocon critiques of Russia. I just would add to that also what's been called liberal interventionism critiques of Russia, because you can't even see the difference now. A lot of the people like Robert Kagan and Irving Kristol and so forth, they're one with their former adversaries. You got Hillary Clinton very tight with these Republican neocons, and they're united by their interest in ginning up hostility to Russia, and that's just where it is. I'm not sure what you meant by exceptions. What I'm citing and what I spent the hour talking about, these are not exceptions. These are just examples. These are examples of patterns that continue again and again, and that form the basis for the propaganda state that we live under. And just as an example, let me give you the titles of the chapters of the Warm and Easy book that describe particular themes that are routinely used as hammers to hit people over the head with deceptive messaging, okay? And this is, again, these are not exceptions. These are systemic propaganda model messages. America is a fair and noble superpower. Our leaders will do everything they can to avoid war. Our leaders would never tell us outright lies. This guy is a modern-day Hitler, and we've lived through several of those. You know, Ho Chi Minh was, Noriega was, Saddam Hussein was, Milosevic was, and I'm leaving out quite a few. This war is about human rights. This is not at all about oil or corporate profits. They're the aggressors, not us. If this war is wrong, Congress will stop it. If this war is wrong, the media will tell us. Media coverage brings war into our living rooms. Opposing the war means siding with the enemy. This is a necessary battle in the war on terrorism. What the U.S. government needs is better PR. The Pentagon fights wars as humanely as possible. Our soldiers are heroes, theirs are inhuman. Withdrawal would cripple U.S. credibility. These are very thematic. They're the threads that weave together ongoing U.S. policy and media coverage.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So my question comes off of what some of the responses that you've given, and this confusion of who is a journalist and who is not, and this contention between Alex Jones and not Alex Jones being a journalist. You have been there, you've done journalism, you're a media critic. What do you think journalism professors should be doing today to ensure that those who go out are journalists? And what do you think is the role of the state, say America, in defining who a journalist is? Because it's harder today to say who is a journalist and who is not. I could write anything and publish and become Alex Jones and I'm a journalist.
It's a good thing we don't license journalists in this country. There's not a journalism license, thank goodness, and that would be antithetical to the First Amendment. In terms of our own standards, as the saying goes, it's a useful one. You get to have your own opinions. You don't get to have your own facts, at least be treated as facts if they're not factual. And I think that that's a standard we should hold people to. And it's what is asserted and reported. Every journalist in the world has made mistakes, inadvertently, usually, but facts should be a standard. And Ben Bagdikian, in his book, The Media Monopoly, Bagdikian, who was a managing editor at the Washington Post, who became a dean of the journalism school at UC Berkeley, he pointed out that in a daily newspaper newsroom, every day there are thousands of subjective judgments made. And we should just be real about it. The myth of objective journalism is a really good myth. It might comfort us, but the fact is we have certain values. No editor goes to work tomorrow morning at a newspaper and says, well, let's have a story about the good things about cancer. We don't want to just come out against cancer, but maybe there's good, maybe that's an extreme example, but you go along the spectrum, and the fact is that American journalists and institutions decided that bigotry is wrong. Decided, and I was old enough to remember many journalists and editors like James Kilpatrick argued against civil rights, but we've decided that racism is wrong. And so the notion that there are values-free journalistic standards is nonsense, and Bagdikian, I think, makes that very clear. At the same time, we do have standards, and I think they revolve around facts, but recognizing that values are part of what we bring to the table and should bring to the table.
Well, thank you very much for coming over. We appreciate it. My question is more regarding social media and the role that it's going to play in the upcoming future. If there's one distinction that is very different from the time of the Vietnam War, is the fact that now everybody can just tweet something in their cell phone or make a post about it. Do you think social media in itself is going to fulfill the vacuum where the actual press and news outlets are failing to provide neutral information? And if so, who and what entity will be responsible for making the information delivered to the public? Say, for example, me as a consumer going to my Facebook, being able to identify whether if that's actual credible fact or if that's just information being portrayed from the lens of someone at a particular point of view. And in addition to that, what is your opinion in the terms of the role of social media in the future, and whether if that's going to curve to say people go into social media to obtain news rather than, say, for example, the New York Times or CNN or any televised outlets. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Well, it's certainly a very moving target sort of question that you're raising, and on a lot of people's minds. One thing I think we tend to forget is that the dominant media, big corporate outlets, have a huge footprint online. And when you look at not only the New York Times or Washington Post, but NPR, other networks, you've got a lot of what is on Facebook and Twitter is being posted and retweeted from some of those outlets. So sometimes mass media will portray it as though they're being shunted aside by social media, and I think that would be an overstatement. That said, of course, the dynamics have really shifted, and it's hard to know where that will go. I would underscore the point then of media literacy, because if people don't have the tools, everybody can be a discerning media critic, but it takes some tools, and hopefully schooling helps that to happen. To be your own media critic, to separate the wheat from the chaff, the nonsense, and to bring a healthy skepticism. I know people who, unfortunately, if they see it on Facebook, somebody put it on their feed, they assume it's true. I want to sell you the Golden Gate Bridge if that's the case. It is dangerous, and we've seen some of the negative effects, so it's hard to predict. I do want to say, though, Facebook, for instance, there are some real dangers because it's privately held. The rules can be changed from 1 minute to the next, and yet it's taken a powerful place as the public square for so many people. And without intruding on the First Amendment, I think we need to recognize, as net neutrality would recognize in terms of the whole internet, something that of course now is under grave threat, to put it mildly, that this is functioning as a utility. And we do regulate utilities so that the public interest can be served and protected.
Thank you for coming. A lot of governments in Western Europe have different rules and regulations so that they can present both sides of the story in terms of media and policy attention. My question for you is, what were your thoughts on the FCC fair doctrine rule? Was it effective or ineffective?
Yeah, thank you. The FCC used to mandate what was called the fairness doctrine. And I remember sometimes if there was a report on the air, or believe it or not, TV stations used to do editorials sometimes, then somebody else would have a point of view allowed on, sometimes necessarily allowed on. Part of the challenge, and I don't think the fairness doctrine worked particularly well, is that it assumed there are two sides to issues. Actually, there's 18 sides or 27 sides. And a lot of times we're actually served up two sides of something. You can get, I don't know, Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, and that's two sides of something, but there's a lot of other sides that aren't being heard at all. So I think that's part of the challenge. It goes to the political economy of mass media. And the fact is that if we were going to have a healthy ecology of media, everybody in this country, everybody who's a citizen at the least, would have a voucher, $25, $50, and they could provide that voucher to a media outlet to help sustain it so we could diversify. Right now, what we have is such corporate dominance that the sensibilities, forget even avowedly corporate media, but public radio, there's a daily marketplace program. There's no labor place program. There's not a monthly labor place program. That's because big capital is saying that the marketplace that fills us with information about the Dow, industrials, and all the rest of it, that's what is most important for us to talk about, think about, learn about, whereas working people, the hell with them. When was the last time you picked up a daily newspaper and there was a labor section? You're not going to find it. New York Times, Washington Post, it's not there. But you will find every day a thick business section And that tells you a lot, just as it tells you a lot that the owner of the Washington Post is Jeff Bezos, the richest person in the world who also owns Amazon. And when the Washington Post announces Bernie Sanders for criticizing Amazon, that's not a surprise, nor is it the fact that, as the Media Watch Group FAIR documented during the 2016 campaign, in one 24-hour period, the Washington Post published 16 articles negative about Bernie Sanders. It's a class thing, and I think I omitted responding actually to that part of the question, which is, yes, there's a class divide, but it's not so much between the workers, the journalists, who aren't often paid all that well. It's the owners, because, you know, if you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, you probably have less to do with policy than the CEO of McDonald's. And the same is the Sulzberger at the New York Times. He has a lot more as publisher and owner to say about policies of the newspaper than some reporter.
Question from the past. Recalling the efforts of Daniel Ellsberg and Tony Russo and their release of the Pentagon Papers, it would seem that the general public, their response to all that was just kind of like, okay, well, let's move on. Would you concur with that, or do you have any other thoughts on what happened with that?
You're referring to the release of the Pentagon Papers in June of 1971,
Yes,
revealing deception about the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Well, I can't do any better than to cite Daniel Ellsberg, who has said to me and many other people that he was disappointed in the response. He wanted the release of the Pentagon Papers to bring about the swift conclusion of the Vietnam War. It didn't happen. It indirectly, because of the break-in of his psychiatrist's office and so forth, and then at the DNC, seemed to lead to the Watergate scandal. That's sort of an unintended consequence, I think. But underneath that, you give me a chance for just a moment to talk about whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg was a classic whistleblower. You have people at Malcolm Gladwell at the New Yorker trying to drive a wedge between him and Edward Snowden, which infuriates Dan Ellsberg. He publicly says he totally supports what Edward Snowden did in releasing of his NSA documents. And this is sort of the point that I would get to. Ellsberg, at a news conference we held through rootsaction.org and exposefacts.org a few years ago, said that, including the New York Times in his case, the position of mass media, the most esteemed highbrow outlets in this country, is to look at whistleblowers like himself like snitches. The way a prosecutor, a DA, a police chief would look at an informer, a snitch. And that's a very negative view, rather than, I would compare it to this. It's like journalists and whistleblowers together are running a relay race, and the journalists carry the baton across the finish line. But they were handed, in the case of the Pentagon Papers, the Snowden revelations, so forth, they were only able to cross the finish line because the whistleblower handed them the baton in the first place. And yet, they often go to prison. People like Thomas Drake at the NSA, Jeffrey Sterling and others who went to the Senate Intelligence Committee. So these are one of the challenges to mass media, to stop treating whistleblowers dismissively and leaving them to be prosecuted and persecuted, but let's see whistleblowing and journalism as necessary cooperative components of journalism itself. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.